Welcome back to Making It Awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson. This episode is a follow-up from my conversation with Dr. David Wiss about his article, Dismantling the Myth of All Foods Fit in Eating Disorder Treatment, which was published in the Journal of Eating Disorders. He talked to me about many things, including food addiction, ultra-processed foods, dopamine, and his concept of a low-exposure meal plan. Today's episode is the first follow-up to that conversation. Another will air next week. After posting clips of Dr. Wiss's interview on my Instagram, I invited him to share any feedback he has on today's interview. In a comment on the post, he replied, quote, "Yes, of course. I'm curious to know if this person is a scientist or clinician, if they have qualifications to discuss the scientific merit of the article, or if it will be more about their own lived experience. Can't wait," end quote. And I'm happy to share with David and everyone else that my guest today is answer E, all of the above. Molly Robbins is a researcher and clinician with lived experience, having gone through eating disorder treatment for atypical anorexia while in a larger body. Molly has questions about whether Dr. Wiss and his co-authors were truly dismantling myths in their article or reinforcing the norm of the eating disorder field. She also poses questions about whether dopamine means addiction and asks what we mean when we discuss reward pathways and brain activation. To expand our ideas of the words and phrases regularly tossed about, Molly references research done in fMRI machines. A functional MRI is an MRI scan that can show which areas of the brain are most active. It can track and compare brain activity to what we were doing in that moment. This has been extrapolated to the idea that we can map brain activity. Next week's episode will be of the emails, comments, and voice memos you have shared with me. Feel free to keep them coming. Today's episode airs Thursday, July 25th, and I'll take any additional comments on both episodes through Friday, July 26th. And with that, here's my conversation with Molly. Molly, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell folks who you are.
Sure. Hi, I'm Molly. I am a PhD student studying clinical psychology in South Florida. I'm originally from New York. The South Florida thing. Yes, I am in America's sunny butthole, as I like to call it. Everybody in my life when I moved to Florida was like, why? This does not make sense. And I was like, correct. But this is where I got into school. It's very hard to find researchers who are in clinical programs who study what I study, which is anti-fat bias and eating disorders, from a lens that is not stigmatizing. Sure. That's like generally what I'm interested in, is that intersection of like, how does anti-fat bias relate to the development of, the perpetuation of, and then like recovery of eating disorders, and how that relates to other contextual factors like identities that people hold. And prior to coming to graduate school, I was more in like the social work field and worked as a victim advocate for a number of years, and was also in recovery from an eating disorder during that time. So it kind of became more than a personal thing, and it became more of like, I think I want to study this and want to treat people who are experiencing this as well. And that kind of brought me to where I am now.
Awesome. And you were the one who introduced me to Dr. David Wiss's initial
You're
article.
Welcome.
I mean, true. I do appreciate having these conversations and knowing about them. How did you come across the article?
I came across the article when I was actually at the Meta conference.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I forget if it was like night 1 or 2, but I had a friend text me the article and sort of say, have you seen this? And I was like, oh man. So I sat down and read it with my research partner who was there at the conference with me. And we both felt really strongly about a lot of pieces of it. And that night decided that we wanted to eventually write a response to it. Both of us are fairly early in our PhD journey, so we have never written a response to anything. We just submitted our first article for publication, like literally last night. So, it was a little bit of like, who am I to say anything to these people who have a whole career of research behind them? But I really care about pieces of research that directly affect clinical care.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something with pretty immediate clinical care considerations and impacts. And yeah, I think it's frightening to me as somebody who really cares about folks in larger bodies who have eating disorders and who could be further stigmatized by some of the rhetoric expressed in this article, and somebody who really cares about science and disseminating information and not doing harm by way of science. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we waited a couple months to really like amp ourselves up to do it. And then we've been writing it and finally have a draft ready. So we'll see if we end up getting it published. But yeah, that was when I reached out to you because I was like, hey, I think I want to do this thing. And I super respect that you were like, no, that's not worth my time. And I was like, yeah, you're so right. You're so right. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah. Can you speak about the potential harms the article could do for folks in larger bodies?
Yeah, so I think generally the article posits that there is this dogma of all foods fit, that across the United States in treatment milieus, there is this pervasive, aggressive, not nuanced perspective of like all foods fit. And that means that you have to like funnel Twinkies every day um, to recover, apparently. So I guess like my first thought is that's not actually what's happening in treatment spaces. As somebody who has both been to treatment and worked in multiple treatment spaces, that's not accurate. All foods fit is still a relatively sort of radical thing to say. And it's not something that I think is as I guess that they sort of frame it as the norm in the article, and I don't
Yeah.
see any citations supporting that. Also, in my experience, that has not been the norm. In fact, the eating disorder treatment industry often really colludes with the weight loss industry and historically has not treated people who presented with different so-called phenotypes of an eating disorder. You know, it's not been a one size fits all approach. It's very much been a one size fits some. And then there's how we treat the rest of the people, which is we either don't admit them to treatment, or if we do, we actually further perpetuate their eating disorder a lot of the time and reinforce the fears that are a significant part of their illness. So I guess like that is one piece for me, is that I don't think this is as much of a dogma. I think it's quite countercultural to say something like there are no bad foods. Also, these phrases are almost always followed up with a phrase that I noticed was missing, which is unless you're allergic to it.
Sure.
Like anytime I have heard providers say this, it's like unless you're allergic to it, or unless it's spoiled, or unless it's not food. So I guess like that feels missing as well. There's like this stigma of not doing research that is me search. Like you shouldn't go into, I think, especially in some of these like sort of like historically exclusionary research spaces, including clinical psychology, of you should not research things that are personal to you. And I think research is personal to everybody. It's like whether or not you are personally affected by it and in what way. But for me, like this topic is rather personal. I experienced a lot of harm through the eating disorder treatment systems. And I see that harm being replicated still today, you know, like a decade after that happened for me, or like when it really started for me. So I think the idea that we need to give different care to different people really based on their body size and based on what disorder we've assigned them, I think that that creates harm. And I would kind of jump ahead and say the authors of this paper would argue, I would assume, that this is not based on body size. This is based on, you know, very individualist factors. However, the paper is pretty weight stigmatizing, despite their claims that we should aim for weight inclusive care. In the context of this paper, I have no idea what that means because what they're describing is not weight inclusive care. So if we were to follow these recommendations, and yes, I have it like printed out with a ton of notes because I'm neurotic like that. But, you know, if we were to follow these recommendations, which we already do in a lot of ways in traditional treatment settings, patients are going to be treated differently if they do not come in as a thin, young, white woman with anorexia restricting subtype.
Mm-hmm.
And thin young white women with anorexia restricting subtype are not the majority of patients with
Mm-hmm.
eating disorders. So that scares me. And it reminds me that like that is already happening. So this isn't that radical, I
Right.
guess. And that also bothers me, is that it's presented as
Yeah.
like this very radical countercultural thing.
Mm-hmm.
And like, this is the norm. Like the eating disorder field has time and time again demonstrated their commitment to this norm. And those of us who are saying alternative perspectives are very much not the norm. We make people uncomfortable and we're not centered in these discussions at all.
And to make clear, the norm that's in the eating disorder community is fat folks should lose weight, which is what the article was saying. And the norms
Yeah.
about food. So yes, treating people differently and weight restoration, etc.
Yeah. And I think making assumptions based on body size. So like they would say that, that this is more about people with so-called food addiction or ultra processed food addiction who are also likely the people with binge eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also point out a lot of people are misdiagnosed with binge eating disorder
Mm-hmm.
when they actually have a different eating disorder. For one thing, like due to things like weight stigma or racism.
Mm-hmm.
And the ways that we harm more marginalized patients really do like trickle down to the most privileged. And like these sorts of narratives are already what our patients believe through their eating disorder. So that's confusing for them, even if they don't experience marginalization from like identities like their race or their size.
Can you speak more to what people with eating disorders already believe? Because people in my practice will talk about either food addiction or ultra processed foods in a way that aligns with this paper.
There's a really good example of this in the eating disorder literature
Mm.
fairly recently. There was a paper by Aiton and Ibrahim in 2020. And one of the things that they said, like, really sort of like exemplifies this. I don't know if it's like a duality or like this mirroring,
Mm.
where yes, like our patients fear these things, but also providers do. So in this paper, they wrote, quote, standard dietary approaches to weight restoration, which often include processed foods and high sugar content, often result in central fat accumulation. For patients with AN, this is a highly distressing experience that can worsen preoccupations with weight and shape and the desire to lose weight, and may result in poor compliance with treatment and a high rate of relapse.
Wow.
So in other words, like the fear of weight gain is caused by a fear of weight gain. And that to me really highlights like this terribly ironic and alarming issue of we are treating something that is, yes, a clinical pathology, but also it's a fear that often we share. And that pathology doesn't develop in a vacuum.
Yeah.
So it's not like somebody randomly wakes up and decides that they need to have, I don't know, like blue teeth. Like just like a random attribute, right? And they're destroying their lives to have blue teeth.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, they have been conditioned since before they were born to fear fatness and to fear weight gain and to also moralize health and food. And we've reinforced that. And then some people have unique vulnerabilities and experiences, and maybe biology, maybe genetics, maybe environment, who knows? We're still figuring that out. But some people then develop a clinical pathology that is, as like sort of trademark symptom of it, reflects that cultural norm. And I think there has to be like a really intense reckoning as a field with, if we aim to improve how we treat this disorder, we have to unpack that fear within ourselves. So that means that even if we ourselves don't need to go to treatment for an eating disorder or something, we all should be unpacking like, what is our relationship with food like? What is it informed by? What is part of my belief system around food? And where did I learn those things? We should be questioning any assumptions that we make, including about our own food. And I think often we ask that of our clients, but we don't require that of ourselves. And that's that's going to create this weird dissonance that our clients are not stupid. They pick up on.
Yeah.
And then we end up telling, thin patients, like, don't worry, I won't let you get fat. Or we tell fat patients, hey, recovery will help you lose weight, no matter what their
That was
diagnosis.
mentioned in the article.
And boy, will you hold on to that if you're told that early in recovery.
Yeah,
I mean, I know
right.
I
And then
did,
what
like,
happens when it doesn't happen?
yeah, and what happens
Uh-huh.
when, like, bodies naturally change over
Yeah.
time?
Mhm.
Life happens, like,
Mhm.
body size is such a multifaceted variable that
Mhm.
we cannot like, have some crystal ball and
Yeah.
predict. So, it's like promising somebody with trauma that, like, nothing bad will ever happen to them again,
Mm.
or,
Mhm.
like, it's just, or like somebody with bipolar disorder that they'll never experience a manic episode again. Like, I think that we're promising things that we can't keep, and we know not to do that with those disorders, but with an eating disorder, it's like, okay, no, I'm afraid of that too,
Mhm.
and don't worry, I'm magical and somehow will protect you from that. Because at the end of the day, I believe that weight is a behavior and you have the control to stay at the weight that you're at,
Mhm.
because I'm probably a thin white guy developing all of this and believe that I have control over my body size too.
Mhm. And am doing everything possible in order to maintain this weight, be it, restriction myself or triathlons or whatever.
Mhm.
It is happening. And if I can do it, you can do it too.
Yes, but the people in the eating disorder field who speak up about having a recovery history, like, those are the providers that we should be worried about, not the people who say, like, no, couldn't be me. I'm very
Mm-mm.
healthy. I just have to go to the gym for X amount of minutes and hours while I'm at an eating disorder conference. But those people who talk about having a recovery history, those are the unhealthy ones. Like, I just, come on now.
I
Ugh.
love that. Yes, the amount of salads as meals that I've been
Mhm.
fed at eating disorder conferences is funny
Or
to
the
me.
ways that we just don't feed people too. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
we can just let's put a special interest group meeting during lunch,
mm,
because we have that time available.
sure.
So,
Because we're not eating. Uh,
no, only our patients have to do that.
I heard what you said earlier in the if we want to change this field or how, we are treating people in this field. I don't think a lot of people do, and that's where we are. But really this what's about is making healthy, thin girls and women.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think part of that is because of the lack of, like, humility,
Mm,
and also inability to, like, pivot. So a lot of people who are very committed to what they see as an overlap between, like, weight management and eating disorders would have to give up where the
yeah.
majority of their funding comes
Yeah.
from. They would have
Mhm.
to renounce all of their previous work,
Yeah.
which is, like, decades of research, and they would,
Mhm.
possibly lose, like, faculty positions.
Yeah.
They wouldn't get as many NIH grants, and I think
Mhm.
that is too, like, it is too embedded in our academic system in a lot of ways that, I mean, yeah, there's no way. And I think often when there is, like, virtue signaling of things like weight inclusivity or anti-diet or
Mhm.
those types of things, it's like, what do you actually mean by that?
Mhm.
Because people who are running really restrictive weight management studies would claim that they're not running a diet program,
Correct.
that they're doing a medical intervention for weight loss. And I think if you
Mhm.
look at the details of what they're doing, it's often not that different, but they need to feel like it's different.
Mhm.
Um, because as a community of humans, we've moved a little bit further away from being like, oh, you should go on a soup diet or something, but not that far enough that, we can't still be committed to it in different words.
Mhm.
Um,
Yes. Currently, I'm thinking about everyone who's building a career talking about ultra processed foods and
yeah.
how is wild because people really need to hold on to the demonization of foods, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that there's a real double standard with what constitutes evidence or what constitutes good science.
Hmm.
So you can just make claims in the weight normative paradigm and not even really need citations for it. You can publish papers that have retracted sources, for example, like this paper. Yeah, citation 9.
Mm-hmm.
in this paper is retracted. So that's fun. But I'm not sure that the authors were aware of that when they cited it. I think often we're looking for things to cite that agree with what we think. And that's a problem that's pervasive, I think, across the publishing world and across academia. But the real lack of sort of a caliber of what constitutes good science and what constitutes good evidence for our claims is really different when you're looking at the weight normative paradigm. You can say things like obesity is known to have all these deleterious health effects, and you
Right.
don't need a citation for that.
No.
Or, I mean, easily you can find hundreds. That doesn't mean that that science is good science and that those conclusions are correct. But when I want to say something like the BMI is a flawed metric of health, I need a ton of citations for that. Or when I want to say something like, so like some of the claims made about ultra processed foods and reward pathways, that is something that then I need to go down several wormholes and have a million tabs open and reading a bunch of articles and learning a bunch of different things in order to interpret, because that is not commonly accepted. Yeah, there's a real difference. And I noticed this, I actually spoke rather publicly about this, which is definitely a faux pas in the ICED world. But at ICED, I pretty publicly during a panel was sort of like, you know, the caliber of evidence for what is required to do something like a plenary on GLP-1 meds, for example, that really sounds like an ad for Novo Nordisk. I mean, maybe then they should be sponsoring our lunch because at least we would get food then. But like the caliber of research needed for certain presentations in that plenary is on the ground. The caliber then for other research that looks at things like weight inclusivity, actual weight inclusivity, or health at every size, or the ways that anti-racism can be interwoven with eating disorder recovery, those things require an incredible caliber of research in order to be presented and heard and to not be sidelined and put at the same time as a million other things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, luckily I didn't get a ton of pushback when I said that, but you're not really allowed to say these sorts of things necessarily. And there's some barriers to doing so, but I'm okay. I think I have a hard time keeping my mouth shut in those situations, which is not, it doesn't bode well for a life in academia, but it is in line with my values. And I guess that's more important. So I don't know.
What did you think of the language used in the article? Words, again, that I'd not heard in succession: low exposure meal plan, hedonic, used in that frame was new to me.
Yeah.
What came up for you?
Well, a lot of things, Jessica, came up. I was really, something that really I think bothers me as a budding scientist. And again, like I'm not claiming to be some sort of expert with the amount of publications and the amount of, professional experience that somebody like Dr. Wiss has. But I am somebody who can check sources, and you can throw around a lot of words that sound smart. You can say that we are advancing scientific knowledge in clinical science, that we are using neuropsychiatry, that we used fMRI research, and those things sound impressive. And, things like dopaminergic and reward pathways and all this kind of stuff. But when you actually examine it, we as a field are not there. Like we cannot claim to really use these constructs in the way that they are often used. So like one example of that is the whole thing about like dopaminergic and reward pathways. So one of the big concepts in food addiction is that, the brain lights up more when we show them certain foods.
Right.
But there's a lot of issues with that argument. So first I want to talk about a fish, and then I want to talk about salience. But have you heard about the salmon study and the fMRI research?
No.
Okay, so I would love to tell you about the salmon study.
Go for it.
So there was a study published in 2010. It was called The Neural Correlates of Interspecies Perspective Taking in the Postmortem Atlantic Salmon, an argument for proper multiple comparisons correction. And in this study, a dead Atlantic salmon was placed in an fMRI scanner. And the researchers presented the salmon with a series of images depicting human social interactions and asked it the same questions that they would ask human subjects in their study. Clearly, a dead salmon would have no brain activity and can't respond to visual stimuli or take in that information. But despite the absurdity of that setup, they analyzed the fMRI data using standard statistical methods that are used in a lot of fMRI research. And this means that they didn't apply proper corrections for having multiple comparisons, because when you do fMRI studies of the brain, there's like a ton of information there. And it's generally broken down into sections that we call voxels, and up to 130,000 of them are in a single study and contrast selection. So when you look at each one to see if it's activated compared to the others, you're likely to get false positives, and you have to correct for these multiple comparisons. So if you're doing thousands of comparisons, you'll run into the multiple comparisons problem, which is an issue in this research, and it's likely that you'll find some false positives. So they did surprisingly find significant clusters of brain activation in the dead salmon's brain in response to the images. And that included activation in regions associated with social cognition and emotional processing. And that could mean that the dead fish are responding to these human images, or it means that if you're doing that many comparisons, you're likely to have false positives. So the purpose of the study was not to say, like, look at what these dead fish's brains are doing. It was to say that we have to have rigorous statistical methodology when we're doing fMRI research. So that's like an often cited study, just to sort of point out the absurdity of like how this research can be used. So then we have to look at salience, because say that we do find brain activation. What does activation mean? A lot of the time we say like, oh, the brain lights up. That means this. But the connection between the brain acting up and us saying this means this, that bridge is built by our own interpretations of that association. So if we believe that food is likely to be addictive and we see activation in areas of the brain that are associated with addiction, we're likely to say, oh, that means that this stimuli is having like the same response as something like cocaine. And in actuality, what activation represents is salience. And cocaine is a highly salient, meaning noticeable stimuli for somebody with a cocaine addiction. For somebody with a food addiction, maybe that stimuli would be more salient. But I think we also have to question, like, what other qualities does that food have other than it being ultra processed? So salience in the brain involves neural mechanisms that prioritize certain stimuli for attention and processing. So it's really a question of how much is my brain attending to this stimuli, to this visual input? And that can be influenced by things like a chemical property of that stimuli. So maybe it's a chemical property of it being ultra processed, or it could be sensory attributes like taste, smell, and texture, novelty, but it can also be things like emotional significance. And we see this in the ways that it involves the amygdala, because our amygdala is activated in things that are also highly emotionally salient. The insular cortex, which is involved in our taste perception and emotional awareness, and the prefrontal cortex, which has to do with decision-making and cognitive control. And all of these regions interact to then help us to determine what stimuli in our environment do we need to attend to, and what are more attention-worthy. And things that are attention-worthy and highly salient also include things like threats. So a bear, if I'm opening my front door and seeing a bear, is going to be super salient in my brain. That doesn't mean that I'm addicted to bears. So dopamine, like dopaminergic reactions have a similar issue here, where like dopamine doesn't necessarily mean addiction. For example, like people with schizophrenia, one theory is the dopamine hypothesis, suggesting that there's excess dopamine activity in certain brain regions, including like the mesolimbic pathway, which is also something that the food addiction people like to talk about, and that this leads to schizophrenia possibly. But people with schizophrenia generally aren't having a super great time due to the amount of dopamine in their brain. So we can't just say that like excess dopamine
Mhm.
is addiction. So similarly to like the fMRI research and brain activation, we're often indicating things other than one process like addiction. Dopamine signaling related to the food intake could be influenced by other factors like learned associations to
Mhm.
that food. So
Mhm.
if I have taught myself, and I've been taught over the years, to avoid something like highly processed mac and cheese,
Sure.
delicious, but also highly salient, then I am going to have a more intense reaction to it when I see it. And that doesn't mean that I'm addicted to it.
Mhm.
So I think that there's sort of a confounding of what is brain activation, what does dopamine activation mean in the context of food? And we're forgetting that food has social context. And we're forgetting that food means something to people and how much anxiety plays a role in eating
Mhm.
disorders.
Mhm.
So, I have a research partner who's really passionate about exposure based interventions for eating disorders and how fear of weight gain is mirrored in providers. And I've definitely learned a lot from her, and really appreciate her work in that area, because when we're looking at research like this, which is saying that, hey, we also need to be afraid of these foods, I think we
Mhm.
have to remember that that is replicating that pathological fear that our clients have. And so something like a low exposure diet, circling back around to that, that was the first time I've ever heard that
Mhm.
term. And it really confused me because the whole idea of exposure is that we
Yeah.
are not fearing the same stimulus that we are exposing somebody to.
Sure.
And I would also point out a low exposure diet, if we are going to do that, means that all foods fit. Because a low exposure to something means that you're not cutting it out entirely. So I'm still confused as to how like all foods fit is a myth.
Mhm.
If even if we're doing it at a low exposure level. Yeah, they have a section in their paper about this idea that treatment centers just kind of want to treat everybody the same way.
Mhm.
And this made me think a lot about my own experience. And I was like, wow, well, that is great news, for me and everybody else who was like really harmed by not having been treated the same as everybody else. Because they say, quote, one size fits all mentality is simple and easy to implement, particularly in treatment centers where services are scaled, staff turnover may be high, and individualized nutritional approaches may be challenging to implement and manage in a therapeutic milieu.
Mhm.
And I was like, wow, I mean, I guess I have to have a lot more compassion to my residential treatment center that I attended, who had a very individualized approach to their fat patients, so much as giving us different supplement drinks and
Mhm.
giving us different exercise rules
Mhm.
and having
Mhm.
vastly different meal plans from other
Mhm.
patients. So I guess I should give them more credit for how challenging that must have been. And yeah, this whole idea that, quote, maintaining the status quo self-serves and eating disorder programs, which then don't have to individualize nutrition approaches and can avoid the clinical work of supporting patients who may be triggered by peers with different nourishment plans. And what they're really talking about here is, hey, you have to treat the fat patients differently, or you
Mhm.
have to treat, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say they're not just talking about fat patients. Let's give these ultra processed food addicted people a different treatment. And yeah, that is going to be triggering to the people who are not allowed to exclude those foods, because it is a symptom of their illness that they share. I guess when I was allowed to like exercise in secret in the nurse's office, that was
What?
actually really good individualized care.
Oh, okay. I'm just gonna note that my colleague Whitney Trotter is gonna insist that you name this place. You do not have to, but she's gonna ask
Yeah.
me. You don't have to, but if you
She
would
can
like.
uh she can reach out. I will
Okay.
happily let her know. I am afraid of litigation, however, so I will
Fair.
avoid name dropping it, but also partly because this is not a one treatment center issue. I think
Yeah.
treatment centers that are not treating their fat patients vastly differently than their thin patients are very much not the norm.
Mhm.
So when I find them, I get excited, but I don't think we're really there with any place
Mhm.
yet where, yeah, we haven't fully unpacked our weight stigma at any treatment center, probably. So,
Oh.
yeah, I mean, again, like it's part of this whole fear of not making research or me search. But for me, this is very much me search in terms of like the different ways that patients are treated. And for me, like that manifested in treatment settings, but it also manifested in individual interventions from like outpatient providers. When I was first diagnosed with an eating disorder when I was I think 15 or 16, I was misdiagnosed with binge eating disorder because of my self-reported binge eating.
Yep.
And so that leads me to say things like, we tend to overdiagnose binge eating disorder, but that's also informed by my clinical and professional experience and the ways that I see eating disorders taught in schools, the ways that I see our DSM, our insurance companies, like reinforcing those misdiagnoses in a lot of ways. So it's not just my experience, but in my experience, that was incredibly harmful because it also led to me being medicated for something like a biological drive to eat food. I was put on medication for binge eating disorder as a teenager, and that happened to make my actual eating disorder, which was atypical anorexia, a whole lot worse.
Yeah.
And I think it really contributed to a lot of my like self-stigmatization of my own eating behavior. So I was somebody who would have told you, 10 years ago that I was addicted to certain foods. And those are some of the same foods that they talk about in this article. And even when I was recovering from my atypical anorexia, I would have told you that I was addicted to some foods. But what I found is that when I fully legalized those foods and demoralized them, or I guess like destigmatized them, I eventually felt a whole lot more chill around them than I did when I thought I was addicted. So yeah, in my personal experience, I think sometimes we think we're addicted to things that are off limits, but a kid who you tell not to press a big red button, who just wants to press the big red button, is also not addicted to the big red button. They're just responding to being told not to do something.
That was incredibly thorough.
I could say so many things, but I'll let you jump in.
Do you want to address throwing Black and brown folks under the bus?
This is actually what made me reach out to you, because I'm going to be so honest. I feel like as a white researcher, it's weird for me to be, or like is just less than ideal for me to be the one talking about a lot of this. But then also I don't want to ask people like you to do free labor around it. And then so I end up in like this strange position of like, well, I'm really upset about this, but is it, I think it's all of our place to be upset about it. But also I think often we end up in an echo chamber of white people talking about racism in the eating disorder field. And I don't love that for us. So I guess that caveat aside, I really hate how they do what a lot of the diet industry has done, what a lot of the public health campaigns around the obesity epidemic have done, and what the obesity world really likes, which is that, hey, like actually those of you who are accusing us of being mean, we care more about marginalized people because look,
can you flesh that out?
Fat.
Can you use the sentence, the section in context here? Can you share the section?
Yes. So toward the end of their paper, because of course this is always an afterthought, they discuss that the eating disorder community disregards the role of the food supply chain, which I also don't see them addressing, but okay, and systemic racism, which I also don't see them addressing, but okay, in food access, and that this further compounds the racial inequities marginalized communities face with regard to accessing culturally attuned comprehensive eating disorder care. I totally agree that marginalized communities face not being able to access culturally attuned comprehensive eating disorder care. However, further stigmatizing ultra-processed foods is not how we're going to get there, in my humble white opinion. So I just, I think there's that. And then there's some discussions about a little bit about racism, a little bit about marginalized folks, and especially how like, hey, obesity is supposedly worse in these populations. Of course, we're not going to acknowledge that these populations are more likely to be labeled as obese because of the way that the BMI was developed, and also the ways that like structural inequities, of course, we're not going to acknowledge those. But the problem with doing that, in addition to it being, I think, pretty objectively problematic, is that then people who are not white are going to be like more disproportionately affected by the harms of interventions that come from this perspective. So people who have less financial access, who are more likely to live in areas with different access to food, who are more likely to be homeless, who are more likely to be marginalized and oppressed in different ways, like are going to be more disproportionately impacted by a paper with pretty immediate clinical implications about ultra processed foods. And I really appreciated you asking him about that and asking about, like, what about my clients who are on food stamps, who have, $9 a week to spend on groceries or less, who are sleeping in their car. And I think it would be really nice if we were that individualized and kind, as he expressed, of like, oh, well, in that case, it's fine. But in reality, that's not how clinical care often operates. And patients who are already struggling with awful barriers in their life and injustices then go into, a SNAP, food stamp application office and are shamed for their food choices, or are shamed in the grocery store, or like, don't even have enough money to buy these supposedly ultra processed foods. So I just think it's a little bit of a straw man fallacy to throw people under the bus like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The commercial determinants of health. I think you were interested in talking about the phenotype discussion. Do you feel like that?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I'm a little bit curious about some of the discussion around phenotype, because, so like literally in the beginning of the article, they talk about, for some people, restrictive eating pathology is a problem. And they say decades of clinical experience have demonstrated that the approach of like All Foods Fit is helpful in addressing the restrictive dimension of eating disorder pathology across phenotypes. So they're saying for people with different sorts of eating disorders, this approach has been helpful. Now we pivot to, however, for many individuals with eating disorders, eating symptoms extend beyond the domain of dietary restraint. The problem there is that they still have the domain of dietary restraint. So you can't treat a patient for something like bulimia, for something like ARFID, for something like binge eating disorder, or like emotional eating or anything, without addressing a restrictive component. And if you are not operating from a perspective of All Foods Fit, I'm not totally sure how you're addressing that dimension. But they feel like, for people who don't fit that phenotype, which they won't say directly is thin and white, but is thin and white, that, this dogma is unhelpful and in fact harmful. But in your interview with David West, one of the things that he mentioned was that he is really interested and cares a lot about like the different phenotypic presentations. And then he said, not just the classic diet culture restrictor, thin white female, classic conceptualization of EDs. And I was like, cool, I'm also interested in that. But the problem is that you are only grouping, thin restricting diet culture with also white female and thinness. So we're going to miss a lot of people if we're grouping all of that into one phenotype, who are in larger bodies, who are fat, who also struggle with what he called diet culture and restricting, what I would call anti-fat bias and dietary restraint, that is, the same, if not more severe than folks who are thin with eating disorders. So yeah, I guess if he's interested in those different presentations, I think that a paper like this really is going to lead clinicians and treatment centers to lean more into some of the different ways that they treat people with eating disorders in different bodies. And that ignores the possibility that a phenotype could include somebody who's in a larger body who is also dealing with restrictive eating and dietary restraint. But in order for this perspective to have merit, you have to believe that for some people, AKA fat people, dietary restraint can be adaptive and healthy. And this is one of the things that they talk about in the article, is like adaptive dietary restraint. This is a direction that the obesity field that is interested in eating disorders is going in, is, hey, and I've had this conversation with people. It's like, hey, we're prescribing people dietary restraint. So how do we measure it? I'm like, well, you measure it. It doesn't really matter that you're prescribing it. You're so close to getting it, right? Like you're inches away. But their conclusion is often that like, yeah, but it's healthy for some people. But if you
Got
look
it.
at like the questions that are in the EDEQ under dietary restraint,
Yeah.
some of those things are objectively not healthy for anybody.
Mhm.
Like, have you been trying to limit the amount of food that you've eaten in ways that are impacting your life, that are impacting your well-being? Do you want to have a totally flat stomach? Have you had a desire to have an empty stomach? Have you
Mhm.
not eaten for 8 hours or more of waking time? Like
Mhm.
those are all things that are objectively pretty disordered, but there's this argument within the obesity field that dietary restraint not only is not a problem, but is actually protective and adaptive and good,
Mhm.
because that further justifies like the need for their research to
Totally.
continue. But research doesn't really support that, and that's part of the problem that usually is not addressed. So some of the research that they cite like toward the end of the paper looks at how dietary restraint might be adaptive. So like for example, they say dietary interventions have been successfully employed in the treatment of this common comorbidity. They were looking at headaches with this,
Yeah.
and this should be routinely considered in the comprehensive treatment of ED patients. So, if the comorbidity is eating disorders and a physical symptom like headaches, you would hope that the citations would be about that comorbidity. You would be wrong. So they cite number 13, 30, and 33. 13 is about kids who excluded 6 foods that included things like cocoa, but also citrus from their
Mhm.
diet to prevent headaches. Citation 30 is a case study of a guy who did not have an eating disorder. And citation 33 is about Iranian women who were following either a healthy or a Western diet, which are apparently different things, but also I wonder what else might be going on if Iranian women are not following a diet that is culturally where they come from. So, yeah, like there's other variables there, but moreover, none of those studies actually are about that comorbidity. But then they go on to talk about later in the paper, like, even for patients who are going through weight management, their eating disorder symptoms are improving. But what they're looking at is never dietary restraint. So, what they're looking at is things like binge eating episodes, things like shape and weight over evaluation. And both of those things actually do tend to improve immediately following or during a weight loss intervention. But that sort of makes sense because you
Yeah.
have a structured eating plan. It's just like when people are on the diet train versus when they fall off the wagon or whatever. Like they tend to be binging less, they tend to feel better about their body, they tend to be purging less also. But we don't have a lot of research, even from what they cited, showing long term follow up. And they often look at things like binging, purging, shape and weight over evaluation, and then global eating disorder score. So that's like all of the subscales put together.
Mhm.
But they very rarely will separate out dietary restraint, partly because they're like, well, yeah, it went up, but that's okay. But they don't even want to say that it went up because they're then going to have to say, like, yeah, my intervention did cause an increase in this variable. But yeah, I think that they want then to like make a career out of, being able to make people smaller and pathologize their food choices and make weight a behavioral factor instead of like examining those things that we were talking about of like how they themselves have some beliefs to unpack and examining like the actual validity of the evidence.
Mhm.
There's an appeal to nature fallacy going on in this paper that I had a research partner point out to me, and I was like, that's the word for it. Wherein we assume that because something is natural or like clean or whole or Mediterranean diet or whatever, that it is healthier.
Mhm.
But the problem is that like that is a fallacy. And there are things that are not naturally occurring, like antibiotics, that are healthy. And there are things that are naturally occurring, like cyanide, that are unhealthy.
Mhm.
So I think that there's, again, like an assumption that is made that is not necessarily supported by evidence that just because something is naturally occurring, that it is healthier. Ultra processed foods are not naturally occurring necessarily, but often they are healthier for somebody like who is going through nutritional rehabilitation and needs a supplement drink that is classified as a Nova 4 level ultra processed food, or
Infant
somebody who
formula.
is having symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome who's struggling to
Yeah.
get in enough nutrition.
Mhm.
A lot of these things are going to require interventions at times that conflict with the recommendations of this paper. Also, it was interesting that they brought up FODMAPs as a diet. I have a lot of feelings about the FODMAP diet as somebody who has had it recommended to her, but I think often it's presented as like a lifestyle change, and it's actually like explicitly supposed to be a temporary elimination diet. And that tends not to be mentioned, but also the citations that they literally gave for the FODMAP diet, both of them explicitly state that you should not use like a restrictive diet on folks who have a comorbidity of an eating disorder that's active. And that's even despite like the second source, the Gibson et al. Citation that they gave, that literally comes from the group that receives financial compensations for sales of FODMAP related materials. Even those people are like, hey, maybe we need to do a better job of screening for eating disorders in GI clinics. Maybe we shouldn't be prescribing exclusion diets for folks with eating disorders. But that, of course, is not mentioned when we're citing that source. Two of the other citations listed around there as like reasons to exclude certain foods had to do with 0-calorie sweeteners, which I thought was interesting because those are something that is often used by people with eating disorders, not because they believe them to have healthy micronutrients, but because they want to avoid highly palatable, obesogenic, ultra-processed foods. And that's why they're often already banned in treatment centers. You won't see like, hopefully, 0-calorie Splenda or one of those 0-calorie sweeteners that they talked about, because we're trying to encourage people to not fear real sugar, because we're trying to encourage people to like, in this case, eat the real thing. He kept talking about real food. So yeah, that's used as like an alternative to those highly palatable things. They also talked about excluding foods for the basis of ADHD. That research was limited to children. Also, the meta-analysis that they cited had more mixed results than they presented. They found that about 50% of the studies in their meta-analysis found an association between ADHD symptoms and dietary intake. But then there was a follow-up study in 2012 by Nig et al., who adjusted the studies for publication bias, and they found that the results were attenuated because of a high risk of reported and experimenter bias and small, not generalizable samples. So about 50% of the studies originally found this effect, but yeah, with publication bias, not so much.
Anything else that you would like to add?
Oh, so I guess what I would add with the idea of like the empirical support for food addiction and the emotional salience of a stimulus like an ultra-processed food, there is limited evidence for food addiction being a separate construct entirely than fear-based hyperfixation vigilance on food. And there's a 2021 study showing that. And that also means that if we are then assuming it is food addiction and telling people to exclude it, we're actually creating further risk there. We know that having highly palatable or ultra-processed foods in one's diet and having a higher variety in your diet is associated with recovery from an eating disorder. And we're not just talking about like people in general in the public in this paper who should be excluding ultra-processed foods. We're talking about people with eating disorders. We're not talking about like anybody who wanders into a dietitian's office wanting to, curb their craving and who feels nothing about their body and food. We're talking about people who are in treatment for an eating disorder. And I think like the risks of that are so high that we really need further evidence that's not provided, that would be an indicated and helpful intervention.
This has been great.
Thanks.
If you want to send me your articles, that would be great. I'll put it in
definitely.
the show notes.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Yeah. And how can people find you?
I'm sort of on social media. I used to do more. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Molly in Progress, and I'm on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it at Dr. Molly in Prog, because progress wouldn't fit. And I used to host a podcast called My Big Fat Recovery. I'm working on having it make a comeback, but yeah, we'll see.
Cool. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It was really nice. I'm a big fan of the podcast. I listen every week. And
thanks.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the work that you do in the field.
Thanks so much again to Molly for coming on the show. And again, if you'd like to share your thoughts on this episode or the first in this series, you can send an email or voice memo to makingitawkwardpod@gmail.com. And if you're interested in how to keep these conversations going, you have a couple options. The easiest way to support the show is by rating and reviewing it wherever you get your podcasts. You can also contribute to the sustainability of this podcast by becoming a Patreon member of the show and supporting the work of our delightful editor, Jen Jacobs. Until next time, friends, make it awkward. This has been Making It Awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson. This is a production of The Body Politic, supported by Patreon members like you and the legacy of Sacramento Outboard Services.